today's video, we're going to look at the 5 most common mistakes when stitching leather using the saddle stitching technique. If you can avoid all of these mistakes, you should end up with great looking stitching. So let's get started. The first and biggest mistake is about the stitching technique. I have prepared a sample of stitching here with the right and the wrong methods for stitching. On the front side, both these stitching lines look exactly the same. However, when we flip this over to the back side, we can see that this bottom stitching line looks incorrect. This top line is identical to the front side, as it is stitched correctly. If we look closely at the bottom line, we can see that the thread is not sitting in the correct part of the hole. This is causing the thread to slant in the wrong direction and sit flat. This happens when you're stitching and you pull on the threads with the wrong angle during stitching. It is really important when you pull on the threads during stitching that you make the stitches sit in the correct part of the hole. I have made a tutorial video where I focus on the correct saddle stitching technique. I'll leave a link to the video in the description. The second mistake is uneven tensioning when stitching. When you hand stitch leather, you want all your stitches to look the same, otherwise your stitching is going to look very messy and not uniform. This sample I have prepared shows some normal stitching in this section here, some loose stitching here, and some overly tight stitching here. The effect of uneven tension is made worse if you're using very thin veg tan or soft chrome tan leather, because when you pull too tight on the threads, the leather is going to be easily squashed together. The best way to fix this is to pay careful attention while stitching and to use firm, even tension on all your stitches. This next mistake is something that is really common when people do backstitching. Backstitching is where you stitch the same hole twice, normally at the start and the end of a stitching line. The mistake is that you lay the backstitches side by side rather than on top of each other. This can make a really elegant looking project look messy and not clean. The way to fix this is to carefully position the threads on top of each other before pulling them tight. You can use an awl or your needle to help do this. When done correctly, it is much more difficult to tell that you have used backstitching. It just looks like a slightly thicker line of stitches. The next mistake is that the chiseling holes are punched too shallow. This mistake affects the looks of your stitches on the back side of your project. I've made a sample here to demonstrate this. On the front side here, everything looks perfectly normal. If we flip this over to see the back side, you can see the top line of chiseling holes is normal, but the second line has been punched too shallow and you cannot see the proper shape of the hole. This bottom stitching line here shows what happens when you try to stitch holes that haven't been punched properly. You can see that the stitching looks flat and not slanted properly. It can also look messy and inconsistent if the shape of the holes on the backside are not all the same. This one is easy to fix by making sure your chisel fully penetrates your leather workpiece. One trick is to put a piece of scrap leather under your workpiece that will allow the chisel to fully penetrate. The last mistake is puncturing the thread with your needle while stitching. When this happens, it will cause problems when you try to tighten the stitches and your thread may untwist and fray. You can fix this by passing the needle back through the thread that it punctured, but it might be tricky and the thread might already be damaged. The best way is to pull on the thread while passing the second needle through the hole, so even if the thread was punctured, it will be corrected straight away. Another way is to pull back on both threads towards yourself and pass the second needle through the back of the hole, so you will be very unlikely to puncture the thread in the first place. So they were the 5 biggest mistakes from stitching leather. If you've got any questions or problems about stitching leather, leave them in a comment below and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.